Hello, friends. This is our last lecturette for this course. I thank you for the patience of putting up with my amateur videos, and I hope that the outlines have provided information and the lecturettes have helped underscore and underline some of those things and maybe explain them a little bit better. We end this class by asking the question, how do we create rituals? How do we adapt rituals that already exist for our people? Um, I'm in a church that says they don't have rituals. So what do we do? Well, the fact is human beings live in ritual patterns. And that the question is how formal or informal, how official or unofficial our ritual patterns are. You should know what your resources are in ministry. You should know um, what it is that your people's language is and how you can speak it effectively to communicate the gospel to them and to help them emotionally and spiritually through all the seasons of their life. Would also suggest that when you think about your congregation and its faith and how it expresses its faith, uh, you should also consider what are the growing edges in your congregation and what are the things that you might push them or encourage them to grow in, and how might you introduce those to your people. I'm going to begin actually not with how to create rites, but how to interpret them. Because I think when you know how to interpret them, that helps you create them. Rituals are windows into the life of a people. I had mentioned that I believe that a culture is best reflected, its values most directly reflected in the way it buries its people. This is a window into the people's values. It says something when you have grave plots large enough for a person to be buried in their Jaguar. That is saying something about what's important in life and what they value. So we should consider rituals of all sorts windows into the people of life. Um, Rituals are constituted by both symbol system and narratives, mythic structures. And you should think about what are the stories and the symbols and what do they mean, what do they represent when you look at a ritual. Rituals define relationships. They define relationships of people to each other and define relationships of people to their history and their tradition. Um, there are some rituals that disconnect you from people, disconnect you from history and tradition, where there are other rituals that reconnect or reinforce connections. There are basic elements of ritual. That is the content, songs, words, gestures, signs. Uh, those are ritual elements that are the content. They're the intent of a ritual. What's the purpose of the ritual? Who contributes to the ritual? Who benefits to the ritual? Think about the controversy about the ritual we have developed in this country of having a moment of national awareness by singing the national anthem at a sporting event. And think about how the meaning of that has been contested over the past 2 years and how politically important that has been to so many because we haven't figured out how to solve that problem yet. Now, most people don't think that that's a big deal until it becomes a big deal and you realize how important something as simple as the national anthem of a sporting event can be. So think about what the intent of the ritual is and who agrees on that and whether there's agreement at all on that. The context of the ritual is important. The space, where does it happen? The time, when does it happen? Does it happen regularly? Does it happen once a year or even less? And I also offer the distinction between ritual and ritualization. Now, my definition is going to vary, disagree with, other ritual scholars, such as Catherine Bell in particular. I believe that ritualization is the creation of a one-off rite. You create something ad hoc for a moment. And Anderson and Foley are filled with examples of sort of in the moment, create a rite for that particular person at that particular time. Now, it's possible that this ritualization might get repeated, and when it gets repeated often enough, it becomes regularized and normalized and owned by a community as theirs, then that becomes a ritual. Ritualization, rituals continue over time, but even when they continue over time, they don't remain static, either in meaning or in practice. They always are changing, they're always evolving. Traditions are always in transition. But a ritualization may never change because it may never get done again. And I think it's very important for you as ministers to acknowledge, I'm doing this in this moment now. And I'm going to draw pieces from other things that are familiar, but I'm not intending this to be something I'm ever going to do again. Although you may surprise yourself, it may come in handy. What are the theological assumptions about Christian rites? Well, Christian rituals, I would suggest, point to and from baptism. Worship on the Lord's Day, the 8th day, was originally a celebration of resurrection, and the reception of communion was an affirmation of one's baptism. You might be praying daily prayers, we learned early in this course, Monday through Saturday, but on Sunday, on the Lord's Day, the day of resurrection, you got together, celebrated resurrection by reading and preaching the Word, and by going to the table, and as Augustine reminded us, receiving the sacrament was a symbol of yourself, and that was affirming your baptism. Say yes to who you are, the body of Christ. There were rites and practices that prepared people for baptism, as we saw, and then after baptism, rites drew on the promises of baptism, healing and funerals, or emphasized the obligations of baptism, reconciliation, and weddings. What makes rituals work is people earnestly giving themselves over to the ritual, of thinking it's important and connected directly to life. Your task as a pastor using ritual as a tool is to use rituals that are familiar and meaningful to your people in such a way that affirms the promises of their baptism or reminds them of the obligations of their baptism. In this way, you are both caring for them and encourage them to grow in faith. So, when you plan a ritual or ritualization, you need to identify what transition in life, what issue in life needs to be acknowledged. Now, I listed a number of things that have come up recently in churches, and there's actually a book that I listed as recommended reading, Evan's book, which is a catalog, an anthology of a variety of rituals. And they come from all different traditions in the English-speaking world, from all different cultures, from all different denominational traditions. It is an expensive book. I'm not sure it's one you want in your library, but it's one you should know exists so you can go to the library and find it, because it may bail you out if you're stuck in a situation. So Abigail Evans' book is a one that you might want to highlight as a pastoral resource that you might want to look at sometime. So there are rights for adoptions. There's rights for people who foster children and have their foster child taken away from them. There are rights to bless a home, particularly after a home has been rebuilt because of a wildfire in California or a flood in Houston or in Louisiana. There are any number of things that you could do. How do you restore someone after they've been victimized? How do you restore their humanity or dignity? Other resource questions that you need to ask once you acknowledge, okay, this is the issue we're addressing. This is the pastoral issue that we need to address. What are the defining issues in this transition? Who's involved? What are the theological issues attached? And what are the social or cultural issues attached? What are the psychological or developmental issues involved? Where is this in the person's life cycle? Is this a life change? Is this a midlife crisis ritual you're dealing with? Wilman Westerhoff suggested midlife confirmation. Recatechize people at midlife because if they were confirmed or catechized, it was early in their life, and life has changed when you get to midlife. And this is an opportunity for them to grow in their faith throughout their lifetime, not just assume they get all of it at the front end and will retain it for the rest of their life. What are the stigmas, if there are any, with this transition? What are the rewards, if any, attached to this transition? So I'd like to use an example of a rather controversial topic, and that is same-sex marriage. I use this because it really illustrates the challenges in our culture right now to creating rituals. Now, it is currently the law of the land that same-sex people can get married. Various faith traditions have come down on the side of opposing or accepting this decision. I don't know what traditions you are in. I don't know what traditions you may be in later in your future. I have no idea what your opinion on this is. But simply taking this for what it is, look at the issues involved in this. What are the theological issues involved? Well, one is, theologically, what's a Christian marriage, and who may be married as Christians in the church or by the church. The social and cultural issues, politically, where are you, what does saying yes or no to this place you and your church? Where does your church stand in this as a congregation? Where does your tradition stand in this? And where do you stand in this as a minister? And how do you negotiate those if there's differences? Psychological or developmental issues involved. You're dealing with people who may have come to their understanding of their sexuality later in life. Have they gone through therapy? Do they need therapy? And this is not to say same-sex people are all in need of therapy, but this is a significant change. And is this their first love? Are they ready for marriage? You need to use the same criteria for anyone who you marry in terms of assessing their preparation for marriage. Stigmas involved. Stigmas for the couple, stigmas for you, stigmas for the denomination and the congregation. The rewards. Well, obviously, there's economic rewards for the couple because they get tax advantages. Are there rewards for you or for your church? My denomination right now has just removed a clergy person and their congregation from our denomination because of the practice of same-sex marriage. I am not either advocating it nor denying it. I'm simply saying this is something everyone's going to have to deal with. And this example really illustrates the importance of going through this checklist before you do the right. Think of all the landmines that might be there, the costs and the benefits, and say, is this appropriate? Then the operative questions. To what extent is this a church ritual? Is this for the congregation? Is this a small ritual? It's a family and friends ritual. Is this a private ritual? Is this something you do with one or two people? In general, what's the personal narrative? The people involved in this, what's their story? And how does this relate to the Paschal mystery? How does this relate to the promises afforded us by the dying and rising of Christ? What are the points of convergence or divergence between their story and God's story? And how do you bring those together or reconcile them? Who should celebrate this rite? Who are the people that should be involved? Who are the people that should know that you're doing this, even if it's just in private? There's accountability that you may need to go through depending on the polity of your denomination or your congregation. What resistance might there be to this rite? You may think this is a good thing for a person or people to go through. Maybe the people don't think it's such a good idea. They don't think it's needed. Is this something you're going to really push for, or something you're simply going to offer? What are the symbols available for this rite? And what texts might be appropriate? How might you connect this to Scripture, its authority, and the story of God's redeeming? Evaluative questions. What is the psychological context? The developmental stages of the participation, transitions experience, and the external events. What happens if a person has been paralyzed in one half of their body by a stroke? How do you pray for this person? How do you bring this person back into the life of a congregation as a full contributing member as they are able now? How do you get the congregation to surround this person and their family in care and prayer? What's the theological context? Are these people of faith? Do they have some faith or none at all? What's the relationship to the community of faith? What happens if people come to you to perform a rite and they are off the street? I need you to help me. As I mentioned earlier in the class, I was asked to perform an exorcism for a person. What do you do in that case? You don't know this person who's off the street. Are there existing rites you can draw from or use? And are there sacraments involved? Is this an official rite of the church? Is baptism or the Lord's Supper involved, etc.? What's the ritual or liturgical context? Who's going to be involved? Do you have other clergy people or other people representing the denomination or your congregation involved? What ritual resources are familiar? What ritual resources will need to be taught or created? So maybe use the 23rd Psalm because it's familiar. Maybe you're going to introduce a new prayer that you're going to have to teach the people so that they might use it at this time. Is this a ritual or ritualization? Is this an ongoing event that you're doing, or is this a one-off rite? What are the signs and symbols? The words, texts, prayers, silences, and music, the gestures and actions that are appropriate to the participants in this event. And how will the stories of people connect to the larger stories of faith? What is the pastoral context? How do you need to prepare the participants for the ritual? And what are the potential landmines of the ritual? You notice some repetition there in that list because I obviously reiterated things that I think are important, like, is this worth doing? Politically, pastorally. Many people have gotten into big trouble making choices, and they've either lived to regret it or not regret it. You should simply know that what you're doing may be controversial, and that in doing so, you're prepared for the consequences. Now, let me give you an example of how to create a rite. So, in my essay that I wrote for initiation of infants in a Catholic context, I mentioned the process of initiating an infant, and would like to focus on the celebration of the conception of life in a couple. So, imagine a couple in their mid-30s who have been married for 2 or 3 years, and they've conceived their first child. They attend Ravenswood Church, which we know well by now, and they go to Pastor Brian and say, we are pregnant. We're month 2 and we're pregnant, and we just want to let you know. So Brian asks if they would like to be prayed for by the congregation. And they agree. They said, sure, why not? So they're brought to the front of the church in a Sunday worship service, and the new life this couple has conceived is announced, and then they offer a prayer. And this Brian's prayer begins with thanksgiving for the birth of this child in the womb. It transitions into prayers for the couple as they prepare to transition from being a couple to a family. And then they pray for the health and safety of the child as it develops in the womb until its birth. The congregation would then respond, pledging their prayerful support to this couple and to the child for as long as they are part of the church. The couple is then introduced to a small group of expecting couples and new parents. This is led by empty nest mothers who mentor the couples, and particularly the mothers, in what to expect. This is a great opportunity to warn people about postpartum depression and to have this group be aware of symptoms of that, not only in themselves, but of people in the group. Postpartum depression is increasingly common and unfortunately is often not attended to. This is also a way that the small group can support the couple as they grow into being parents, and hopefully this group will be a support group for years to come as they this couple has other families that their children will be growing up with together. The couple also meet with Pastor Brian. And somewhere, probably month 6 or 7, he gives them the options that a covenant church would have, which is either dedication or baptism, and describes the differences between the two, and also begins talking to them about having a regular time of devotion as a couple together, and being ready to expand that to including children, so that they have a regular pattern of devotional practice as a couple that they can continue as a family, rather than start a new practice once the children are born or the child is born. It is, if you have children, you know, starting a new thing when a child arrives is not a good idea. It's easier to maintain something that you already have been doing than to start something new once children arrive. Life changes when children come. Theologically, this process takes seriously the life that begins at conception. It prepares the couple to be the primary catechists for their children and emphasizes the church's role in supporting families and their children. The church needs to provide parents with resources to fortify their faith so that they can help their child grow into faith. Pastorally, this builds bridges between the pastor, the broader church, and other couples the same age having children the same age, establishing both mentors and peer support that can last beyond the birth of the child. It also allows the church to respond intimately to any crisis the couple may have in their pregnancy or birth, including allowing for public grief if this child is not carried full term, as life is already publicly acknowledged. One of the things that you read in Anderson and Foley is that many people lose children before they're fully developed in vitro, and they never publicly grieve. They can't because the life was never publicly acknowledged. This provides this opportunity. So there's an example of creating a rite that can be used in any tradition. You can adapt that to your congregation, depending on its size, depending on its nature, etc. That's simply an example. I'd like to summarize this class in 3 ways. First, in terms of ministry, pastorally. Ministry, I would suggest the takeaway from this class, occurs in a particular context with particular people, and ministers need to attend the particularities of their situation, of their people, to be effective. Second, worship. Worship introduces people to God's story, the story of God's redemption through time and God's redeeming love, and gives people the vocabulary they will need to pray through all the seasons of life, however high the mountains, however low the valleys, that through the course of a year after year after year, they are given language of lament and praise and thanksgiving and remorse and grief. That is our duty in worship, to give people a vocabulary of faith. Last, in terms of caring for people through their life seasons, give people the opportunity to affirm their baptism in all of life's circumstances, to say yes to their faith, regardless of whether the circumstance is a good or a difficult one. And at the same time, to constantly remind people of the obligations of their baptism, of the covenant they made with God, and that they can continue to grow and to live into them. So pastorally, through the seasons of worship, through the seasons of life, all of these things converge as ways that we use pastoral rites to care for the people God has entrusted into our care. May we always be good steward of the people God has given us to care for. I thank you again for your time, and we'll see you soon.